is audible.
Your Honor, let me read you a story. Though, before I do, I must ask, what is reading? Before you today sits my client, the audiobook, who's had their name raked through the mud, who's been called, among other things, a cheat, a shortcut, and worst of all, lazy, easy, effortless, passive. They've been libeled, or more accurately perhaps, slandered. And unlike most of my other clients, the audiobook isn't voiceless. In fact, all they have left, Your Honor, is their voice. A voice which I intend to defend today. In order to do so, we must first look into the past. You see, before TikToks and YouTubes, before TV and movies, even before theater, books, pens, paper, before any word or letter or symbol was ever set down in any writing, ever, we told stories. But how? Well, like this, person to person, mouth to ear. I didn't like saying that. We take it for granted now, but for most of history, humans couldn't read. In fact, I still can't. Thus, we relied on the passing of stories through listening and remembering, with no accompanying written word at all. Some of the oldest and most famous documents throughout history never had a written counterpart until the modern era, including the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Bible, and the prosecution's mom's birth certificate. Eventually, however, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we learned, and in some cases are still learning, to read and write things down. And the stories we told evolved to fit their respective mediums, catering to a vast and diverse audience of varying reading comprehension abilities. And so, we've arrived back where we started. Your Honor, let me tell you a story. The story of why audiobooks are in fact guilty of being books. This video is not sponsored by Audible, but it'd be really funny if it was. The prosecution's argument for why audiobooks do not count as reading hinges on 3 primary axes. Let's start with the first. Simply put, listening is not reading. Reading, so we're told, is something physical one must do with their eyes. And that if you listen to someone or something read a book to you, then you didn't read it yourself. It would be like saying you drove somewhere when really you had a friend drive you. Now, normally, Your Honor, I would start here with something like a definition. However, in this instance, wouldn't it be true to say that reading, by and large, is a pretty cool and good thing? And the more people that have access to reading, the better society is as a result? So why spend our time trying to limit the definition of what it means to read something as long as the end goal remains the same? Are stories not meant to be enjoyed, dear jury, regardless of their format? Or is the format in which they are delivered to your brain just a means to a moral judgment and Goodreads bragging rights? Either way, the prosecution would perhaps agree with the Encyclopedia Britannica definition, the one that says to look at and understand the meaning of letters, words, symbols, etc. Also, just want to point out that the second definition here just says to read the words of. Not doing me any favors here, okay? But all this to say, what about the blind? Yeah, shout out to my blind kings and queens watching this video right now who, yes, are watching this video right now. Let me tell you something about language, my sweet, sweet jury, okay? Listen. Listening? It's not that precise. Because when we ask someone if they've watched or read or whatever something, we're not referring to the actual method of experience. We're really just asking them if they have experienced it. And if not, then I suppose you might say that when the blind are reading Braille, they're not actually reading Braille, they're touching it. And when the deaf speak sign language, I know the prosecution wouldn't have a problem telling them. As a matter of fact, I'm certain that the prosecution would agree that thing in their pocket is not a phone at all, because that device is a hell of a lot of things, and a telephone is way, 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 way down at the bottom of that list. And I should know, he hasn't called his mother in a while. She was telling me last night. This argument, therefore, Your Honor, I gotta say, kind of discriminatory, kind of ableist. Who's to say then that reading out loud at all, even to yourself, should count as reading either? It should really be called recital. The state's argument is simply pedantic. It doesn't matter how someone absorbs a set of information, whether it's using your eyes or your ears or your little fingies, the end result remains the same. When asking if someone has read something, what you're really asking is, do you know the story? Otherwise, what's the point of asking the question? After all, why do we read? We read, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to share stories with one another, not to brag or gatekeep, but to include. Imagine the following scenario. You ask a friend, have you read Game of Thrones? They respond, yes, they have. You both strike up a conversation about the story, characters, if he's ever going to finish those goddamn books, only to discover, wait, they never read the book with their eyeballs. They listened to Roy Dotrice narrate it with his silky, buttery voice. So I ask, even though you were just fully engaged in the discussion of the book a moment ago, does the revelation of a different medium they consumed it with suddenly mean they never read it at all? Yes, the prosecution would say, because the medium matters. Listening to an audiobook is not reading a book in the same way that watching a movie is not reading a book. Some books, my colleagues might say, like Game of Thrones, are simply meant to be books and should be left alone. They really should have left those books alone. How on earth, my colleague might say, are you supposed to listen to this? Or this? Or this?
A man with a broken bass drum. A man dropping his trumpet. A woman in a yellow tank top. Waldo. A man in a...
But are these even really books in the way we're discussing, Your Honor? These are not only extreme examples, but extreme examples of visual works. These, like many others, including comic books, have an integrally visual component which can't be removed without drastically altering the meaning of the work. Novels, plays, and poetry, on the other hand, are already read aloud, in a sense, by the voice in one's own head. So what's the harm in having someone else take the load off? That's not lazy. That's not passive. That's bonding. The work, after all, hasn't been transformed in any major sense like described video would for a movie, play, or painting. This is because described video exists as a resource or supplement for people who can't enjoy visual works in their original form. Audiobooks aren't removing elements in the same way because the words, in this case, are the story. Whether they're delivered to you visually or via your little ear holes, you still read the same story. Two different people can watch a baseball game, one at home and one at the stadium, live in person, but they both still watched the same game. But you might say, Your Honor, this simply opens the floodgates. Why then can't a radio play or a podcast be an audiobook? Joe Rogan is simply my favorite narrator. And sure, back me into a corner. Let's do it. Let's define audiobook in a way in which we can all agree, because a podcast, while sure, is an audio-based form of entertainment, it must still meet the following criteria in order to be called a podcast. It must be primarily audio-based, episodic. There must be a clearly defined host or hosts. It must carry a central theme or through line through all episodes, and your listeners have to be insanely annoying, while an audiobook, yes, is primarily audio-based, but it's also a narration of a previously published written work and released all as one cohesive program. So can we all agree? Is this good enough for everyone? What's that? No? Not for the prosecution? No, of course not! Because they would say, even if we can agree that listening to an audiobook counts as reading it, and even if we can agree on what the hell an audiobook even is, none of this matters anyway. Because you see, listening to a novel is a lazy, passive experience, you know. You don't have to pay as close attention All right! I didn't want to have to do it. I didn't want to have to go here, but let's do it. Now that we're here, let's do it! Because, Your Honor, this is simply another distraction. The question was never whether or not listening to audiobooks was better. It's does the act of listening to them count as reading in the first place? This is, after all, a slander suit, not a who's better than who suit. But I suppose with my colleague's background in divorce law, he wouldn't know the difference. But let's engage that argument. Witness for the defense. A study, that's right, with science, which took 91 participants and had them all read the same nonfiction book, but randomly assigned each with either absorbing the material via a traditional paper text, Kindle, e-reader, or with an audiobook, and afterwards tested them all for comprehension. And you know what? They found that, quote, no statistically significant differences were found for any analyses pertaining to effects of the 3 different instructional conditions on comprehension, or in other words, they got the gist. Moving on. It's just silly to argue that one medium of delivery is better than the other at all. The state might argue that physical books are preferable because you can go back and reread and stop and go at your own pace and learn how words are spelled out, which is like fine. Fair points. But to that, I would say, how do you know how this person's name is pronounced? How do you know? Oh, wait. Oh, for all my blind kings and queens still watching this video right now, I'm currently showing a photo of a character from Harry Potter who my colleagues across the bench might refer to as Hermione. Do you see? Do you see how we're splitting hairs here? What does it matter if one is a more passive activity than the other? Isn't that a good thing? You can't read a book while you're driving or cleaning or making a closing argument, but you can with an audiobook. But again, this is all a distraction from our original question, a question which you, the jury, must decide. Is listening to an audiobook reading? No, not is it better for you, but simply, is it? And so, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you, wait, what is that? Do you hear that? Do you hear the music, ladies and gentlemen of the jury? This masterpiece of melody and harmony, is it meant to be read on a sheet of paper, dear jury? Or, much like my client, must it be heard to be truly appreciated? The prosecution would have you believe that physically reading the sheet music is the superior experience, that you should toil over each note, examining every phrase by yourself in utter silence. But I say to you, my friends, there's a reason why we have musicians who can breathe life into those notes. And there's a reason why we have narrators who infuse stories with nuances and emotions that might be lost in the sterile pages of a book. Even still, some might prefer the music in their head when reading in silence, and that's okay. But in this case, it's not a matter of preference. It's a matter of inclusion. As you ponder this, letting the music wash over you, allowing the conductor and the musicians, these narrators of sound, to guide you. Consider this. Is this passive? Is this lazy? Does this require no effort at all? Are you engaged? I would say yes, because you want to listen. Because if the prosecution really believes that because listening is passive and therefore doesn't require any effort at all, then I feel sorry for his wife. I rest my case.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.